Okay, year 12. So I asked you to turn to page 218 where we've got face left, face right, face left, which is when the deck is explaining the selections to Artie, and time turns back into itself. So I almost should have put pictures in here, but you should know by now what I'm talking about. The 4 panels, and then in the 4th panel it is drawn. Spiegelman draws it as the historic narrative. We're in the first 3, we're in the frame narrative, we're in the present. So the present visually turns into the past, okay? And I hope my page numbers are right. I don't have a book in front of me. I'm reasonably sure they are. Alright, so Spiegelman recognizes the transformation of Ledeck from past to present and visually depicts Ledeck turning back in time. Alright, so I'm playing with words there, turning back in time to his former self. And why? To cement how physically different Ledeck is since his survival. So we see him side by side, so the word is juxtaposed or contrasted as an old man compared to the famished, beaten Jew, but nevertheless we can see the difference, old, young. So while Ledeck may have survived the war physically, there is evidence that he bears the cost of survival, all right? And we're referencing here his neuroses, and I've checked in the quote from Marla. She says, she too went through the camps and nobody is like him. All right, remember that's the conversation she has with Artie. If any of this sounds unfamiliar, you probably need to go back and do a little bit more groundwork before you watch this video. All right, my link has to come back to my essay question about the past is never over. So Ledeck remains unable to overcome the past, which in turn becomes a determinant of his identity. Ledeck's identity is determined by his Holocaust survival, okay? Let's talk about Artie's guilt. All right, I've just pasted in our essay question. Again, the past is never over. Is this argued? All right, so this time I'm arguing that the past is never over for Artie. That Artie shows the ongoing impact the past has. All right, that Spiegelman depicts the cost of the past through the character Artie. Got that? So my topic sentence, throughout the novel, Art is plagued by guilt. So guilt from the past as he continues to live an easier life than his parents. Talking about the past, Art is unable to comprehend the trauma his parents faced. And then remember, it's a result of his inability that he reconstructs this because he wants to understand their past. So the past is so prevalent for Artie that we see a whole book created around this whole idea of understanding. Remember, the meta-narrative was all about him, Artie, trying to understand Anya and Ledeck's Holocaust experience. Now, the first example of guilt is a pretty obvious and easy one again, and I'm going to talk about time flies. So, if you're not familiar with time flies, go back to your book, part 2, chapter 2, all right? When we've got the guilt flies. So this is the bit where Artie's at his desk. So I'm saying Artie, in Mouse 2, Spiegelman depicts Artie diminished in size and he rises out of a pile of dead bodies. Remember, that's a literal drawing. It's like the pile of Jewish bodies down the bottom, the Holocaust survivors, and then him rising out. So he feels like he's guilty because he found success. Of course, the success referenced is the success of Mouse 1, because remember, they're published in 2 separate parts. So Mouse 2 was published after Mouse 1. That's why we get the complete mouse, as someone told us in class. All right, so Mouse 2 reflects on the success of Mouse 1, and he feels guilty about that. And remember, the flies are what we would call guilt flies. Those flies, if we're calling them time flies, if we're going to think carefully about the title, all right, have flown from the past. They're rising up from that pile of dead bodies and hovering over him. So the past is haunting Artie in book 2. So I'm going to still use this part of the book, those first couple of pages of time flies, and I'm going to talk about the way, for my second example, that Art compares his life to that of his father's continually, and how that signifies his guilt. So I've just used the quote between May 16, 1984 and May 24, and that's missing a 9, 1984, 100,000 Hungarian Jews were gassed. So Artie compares his own excess to his father's survival, ultimately reinforcing the extent to which the Holocaust was a formative experience in Artie's life. So remember in that passage there at the start, he continually juxtaposes what's happening in his life at the moment to what happened in his father's life. So even the birth of their first child, he compares to what his father went through, suggesting that he always feels guilty, all right, that he is always plagued by the guilt from the past, okay? And Art says, to prevail, no matter what I accomplish, it doesn't seem like much compared to surviving the Holocaust. And that's really apt because it's exactly how he feels. He feels like the past, the Holocaust, means that he is inadequate. How can he possibly live up to what his father and his mother experienced? And that leads us nicely on to example 3. Remember, he has those conversations with Francois, and he talks about like Cyclone B coming out of the shower head. So this quote I pulled directly from there, from the meta-narrative. And the quote is, somehow I wish, and I've got it back to front, somehow I wish I had been in Auschwitz. And I think the rest of it was with my parents. And I think that's really apt because, again, it shows the depth to which he's so desperate to understand the past. All right. So he actually, in the meta-narrative, talks about his guilt and his inability to understand their past, okay? So the past affects his life, like, constantly. So if you think about, like, the very first pages of the book and the epigraph, we see, you know, Vladek compare Artie falling over to his Holocaust experiences. So you can kind of understand how Artie is always thinking about the Holocaust. But then we've got to talk more about the visuals. We talked about the visuals before when we talked about the flies and the bodies that he rises out of. But the other thing that we've got to mention is the smoke. So remember that we've seen the chimney right throughout the book of Auschwitz, and the smoke from Artie's cigarette, and how they continually like line up with each other. So we could argue there that this shows how like the Holocaust continues to impact. And you know, we can even say that in part 2 we can actually see the watchtower and the light shines down, and people have said too that at different points when they're silhouetted, you could argue that it's the watchtower, the light from the watchtower, okay? But again, you can find your own examples, okay? I'm just giving you somewhere to go. But then when you finish that paragraph, you've got to come back to this idea that Art is plagued by guilt and struggles to understand the life of his parents, okay? So, the past affects him. The Holocaust, his parents' Holocaust experience, affects Art because of his guilt. Now, last but not least, now, this paragraph is a little bit incomplete and I didn't have my book with me tonight to finish it off. So you might have to do some thinking of your own when you get to this stage. All right, so this is where we need to talk about the graphic novel format and the fact that it allows a transition between past and present here. So I said in The Complete Mouse, Spiegelman is able to interweave the past and present in a fluid narrative, not only recounting the events of the Holocaust, but the continued impact, all right? So we know that this is all about the continued impact of the past, all right? But what about what happens with the graphic novel format? Well, only through the graphic novel format can we have a frame narrative and historical testimony. Only through this triple-tiered narrative can we understand the impact. So we can say in The Complete Mouse, time is irrelevant. Spiegelman shifts between the horror of Auschwitz to Rego Park, New York, with the effortless stroke of a pen. And I was trying to think of the example when they were walking and talking in the present, but the background slowly becomes the historical narrative, okay? But I couldn't think of that example. So if I just find example, you guys are smart enough to know what I'm talking about, and hopefully when you listen to this, you've got a book handy. You've also got to argue that through the graphic novel format, we can see the different time frames because we've got guttering, borders, and panels. And we can say that in a traditional novel, it'd take pages. You know, you wouldn't be able to flick between the past and present and show the impact, but here you can. And you might even talk, you know, thinking about an example, you might say the wheel of Vlodek's exocycle physically intrudes into the present. All right, so that might be one of the examples that you use. All right. The contrast of Spiegelman and the cost of survival is enabled through the flexible graphic novel format, and of course, like, there is this self-reflection on Art's behalf as he wonders about the graphic novel format, all right, like whether it's the right format to do it in, all right. But you can argue that through the meta-narrative, which is, you know, possible only through the graphic novel, can't spell tonight, audiences witness how fixated artists on recreating the past, which not only shaped his parents' identity, but his own. That last paragraph's a bit shoddy, I must admit. I don't love it, but it gives you the right idea. I hope you just need to come up with stronger examples. I think more tangible examples. The best essays have really clear, specific examples weaved right through. And then you might start an intro off by saying something like, the relationship between a past that did not impact him directly and an identity that is irrevocably bound up in the Holocaust memory lies, and it shouldn't say out, it should say at the heart of the postmodern text created by Art Spiegelman. And then you'd go on and say something like, as seen through the, I'm not sure, the visual depictions of the past impacting upon the present, and the extent to which both Artie and Vlodek's lives are shaped by the Holocaust. But I think you could do a better job, but just remember, please, short, sweet conclusions. Please don't write me really long conclusions, okay? Keep it to the point. This essay is probably too long overall. By the time I type it all out, we'd probably be looking at over 1,000 words, but I hope this was helpful.